Hello. So I know I recorded a few other videos on personality that you may have noticed briefly I uploaded and then I deleted them. The reason for that is because I think rather than go straight into personality and continue the series I was doing on like the analysis of identity, there are some more like fundamental metaphysical concepts that need to be touched upon before I go any further with that because I don't want to make personality seem like, or at least identity seem like it's mostly about like temperament and personality. There are deeper things going on that you should know about first. So for this, I'm going to be drawing a lot from Lacan. That's a name I've mentioned before. I'm really fond of his work, and I'll probably be, by extension, talking a lot about Freud, Sigmund Freud, and I'll probably also bring a lot of Jungian ideas into it. I'll be all over the place with this. Um, but what we need to establish, first of all, is the nature of reality, because when we're talking about like analysis of identity, what we really mean is like what does it mean to be a subject, right? What does it mean to be a self? What am I? Like, what am I? And this might seem like a really straightforward and easily answered question, but therein lies the trap. It's not. And the easy answer that you can just immediately pull up and throw at that question is a fantasy. It's not real. In fact, reality, as we normally refer to it, is completely a fantasy. Anything you can imagine, anything that you could see or touch or taste, any sensations, and even anything in your mind that you could ever dream of, that you could ever imagine, all of that is a fantasy. Now, um, that is not a very contrarian point of view, actually. If you know much about, um, I mean, science for that matter, do you realize that we live in a phenomenal world? We have the realm of phenomenons, the phenomenal world, which is what they call subjective, okay, like the subjective world. And then beyond and outside of that is so called external reality, which is the objective world. And while that is the case, unfortunately, a lot of people make a mistake here. They make a fundamental categorical error, which is that they assume that their physical experiences are one to one with the objective world. But that is not true. Your physical experiences are part of the subjective simulation, the holodeck, if you will, that your mind is constructing in order to represent the objective world. And this concept of representation is going to be very important going forward in this video that I'm making. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that there is a distinction between what is being signified and the signifier that we use to signify it. Okay, the signifier that we use to signify things is the sensation that you have of something, or the way you imagine it. But it goes beyond that. It's also the rules that we use to try to understand it, define it, and give it structure. The definitions, the categories we place things into. Okay, all of that is symbolic representation, like grammar, language, and the rules of it, math, logic, all the ways of knowing, all the epistemological like methodologies by which we can say we know it or we know something. Knowledge is formally defined, for example. I believe this is like St. Thomas Aquinas came up with this or something. It's the correspondence theory of truth, that thoughts ought to conform with things, and that knowledge is a justified true belief. Okay, but those are rules, and they are, to quote from The Big Lebowski, yeah, but that's just like your opinion, man. right? And so, what is an opinion and what isn't? Well, unfortunately, again, people can be very arrogant in assuming that they know facts, but you can only ever know opinions. Facts are impossible in a sense. It is impossible to know a fact, at least from the point of view that I'm touching on here, from the Lacanian psychoanalytical point of view. So, what do I mean by that? Let me explain what I mean by that. Um, Again, you have all the things that you can imagine and all the things that you can, all the phenomenons that you could ever experience that your mind can represent. And then you have all the rules for categorizing them and all the structure that you think they have that you can use to try to make predictions and force them into systems so that you can control them and manipulate them, or avoid being controlled and manipulated by them. And all of that amounts to essentially reality. And if I left it there, that would seem to be all that there is, right? There's just the outside world, the inner world, and all the rules that govern both. Well, then what else is there? This is where Lacan touches upon a difference between reality and what he calls the real. So there's a third dimension to our existence that is not imaginary and it is not symbolic. And so that means that by its very nature, it cannot be an image. It cannot be something that you experience. It cannot be imaginary. You can't imagine it, all right? And it cannot be symbolically represented. So no rules can define it. No language can explain it. No structure can represent it. It is post-structural, right? It's like postmodern. It would be deconstructive, different from everything. It would be something that is literally impossible. Even concepts like transcendence or the spiritual or something like that, or supernatural or whatever, don't really touch upon this. So from the Lacanian point of view, the real is actual objective reality. But what we tend to call objective reality in our everyday lives and in science and this and that is actually subjective reality. So he's doing this sort of like Copernican revolution thing. He's inverting the whole system and saying that everything we call objective reality is a fantasy. Objective reality is, by definition, a fantasy. Your senses, the external, all that is just a projection. It's just your imagination. It's a fantasy. And that behind all of that is something real, but because it's real, it can't be imaginary. You see? He's setting up this categorical like limit to knowledge, saying like, look, the real reality can't be knowledge because knowledge is a representation. It's a construct. So the real is by definition that which is not a construct, which cannot be constructed. It just simply is and is what it is. Now, if there's anything like that, then we could never know it. We could never like completely and perfectly define it. So is there anything that comes close to something like that we could imagine, that we can imagine? Like are there imaginary things, are there symbols that come close to something like that? All right? And there are. It turns out he believed those were dreams. So from Lacan's point of view, dreams come very close to reality. Much more than our conscious experiences do. Our conscious experiences are far more of a fantasy. They're more imaginary, and they're symbolic. They represent something that cannot be represented, the irrepresentable. And so when you get into like really wild and difficult to translate dreams, then those actually come closer to true reality, like the real. So these are important ideas to keep in mind because when I talk about identity, I want you to like remember this stuff. Remember that what an identity is a fantasy. This idea that you have like a self, that you have like an ego pattern, that's like you, okay, is fundamentally a fantasy. That is a fantasy. The real you is something that you could never know. You could never comprehend it. You could never represent it. You could never you could never imagine it. It can't be symbolically represented. There's no rule, no definition, no category that can contain it. And you can create such things and come close, but never one to one, never exact. It's just a representation. It's just a subjective experience that you're having of yourself that is by its own nature transcendental. Okay? So, how does this work? How do we construct our identities and how do we construct reality? Well, it starts as an escape. And the origin of that escape would be called birth. Okay, so this earliest memory you have of coming into being is the beginning of your fantasy. So the moment, the farthest back that you can remember, whatever that may be, is going to be sort of like the starting point for the story, the narrative in which you find yourself. And this narrative is a fiction. It is a fantasy. It is a science fiction, fantasy, whatever story. Your life, your identity, your memories, and everything that you think is real is just like a story being told. And it's a story you're telling to yourself. And the thing is that there is a real world outside the book. There is a true like meta to reality. But the thing is that you are trying to escape from it. And that escape is this life that you find yourself in. Okay? This body that you believe you have. These memories that you believe are yours. And all the things you're experiencing. Every moment, every event in your life, and all the complex structure that you think is external to you, that brought you into being, your parents and their parents, and like the earth orbiting the sun and the birth of the cosmos, and all those things, those are all part of your fantasy. They're all part of the narrative you have written, you have created to escape from the truth, essentially, the absolute truth, true reality. And it just so happens that you are surrounded by people that you imagine are doing the same thing. You see, there is this sort of solipsism I'm getting at, where, like, in pure logical terms, solipsism is self-refuting. Now, solipsism is just this idea, this philosophical concept that the only thing that's real is you, and that everything else is just a figment of your imagination, and then only you are real. And that comes from René Descartes. It might even be before him, but René Descartes, I think, with his cogito ergo sum argument, that like the only thing you can know for sure is that you exist, because you would have to exist to think or know anything. Before you could have knowledge, there'd have to be a you to know. So then you cannot doubt yourself, right? You can doubt everything else. Everything else could be an illusion. And that gets to sort of like the root of what we're talking about here, right? You cannot doubt yourself. That's true. So we know there is something that is real, that is beyond fantasy. But everything else besides that fact is questionable. And so the rest of it has to go into the category of possibly real, possibly not. So in the realm of sensations and thoughts and feelings and imaginary and symbols and all this, it's open to doubt how much of it is real or influenced by reality and how much of it is just bullshit that you made up. And you can never know. You can never actually know for sure what the difference is. But there are things that come close to it. You can have sort of an intuition. You can have like intuitive insights, like introspective hunches about what that might be like. And Lacan and Jung and Freud all kind of agreed that it's something in the unconscious, that it's the unconscious. And it's sort of, for Lacan, it would be dreams. And I think Jung would agree with this. I think Jung would agree with Lacan here. I don't think he would agree with everything Lacan had to say, but Lacan is coming later in the historical sequence of psychology. He's coming after Freud and Jung, so a lot of his work is sort of synthesizing everything that came before him in the various schools of psychoanalysis into his own school of thought. And I think he does a very good job of pulling a lot of different ideas from Freud and Jung and others into his work, especially Hegel. He takes a lot of Hegelian dialectic into his work. And Hegel, I want to say, is kind of like pre-postmodernism because it was like Friedrich Nietzsche and Gilles Deleuze and others that are very Hegelian in the way that they look at things. Although I don't think that Gilles Deleuze would agree with that. He would say he's not, but yeah, but that's just like your opinion. So, other people might say he is. I would say he has a lot of Hegel in him in what he's saying, and so does Nietzsche, and so does Lacan. And what I'm talking about by Hegelian, I mean like the whole idea of like a thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, like this cyclic process. And that even gets into like Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he talks about the hero's journey, the monomyth cycle of like, the call and then the unknown and then the return, right? Like there's like those three cycles to every story that's ever been told. Well, not every story, but like most stories, like all the most common ones. You see that over and over and over. There's like a call to adventure, and then they refuse the call, and then they have to go, and then they finally do, and then like they have like a mentor that helps them, and they receive a boon, and not yeah, they cross the first threshold, yada yada yada, and then they steal fire from the gods, and they confront the father figure, and they find the mother goddess, and then they have to return to society and reintegrate and escape from the unknown, and there's like this cycle, right, to every like narrative structure. And that is very similar to the Hegelian structure. Are you seeing it? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you start out with some kind of call to adventure, the thesis, and then you face your antithesis, which is like the opposition, the contrarian, the contrary, the conflict to your idea. And then you synthesize something out of the two and come to a reconciliation, a compromise, which is the return to society. You see? So you see this theme like very, very like over and over and over in philosophy and literature and in science and everywhere. And I think there's something to that, right? That's not just a coincidence. So there is the real, and the real is like that. Stuff like that is very close to the real. These deep structures to reality are like real. But reality itself on the surface is not real. That's just fantasy. Um, and we have like so many layers of dissociation. Like here I am in this like vampire girl avatar in virtual reality. Now we're like a layer out of like there's like dissociation from the real that creates like the physical reality, the meat space, and then there's another layer of dissociation from that because even that's not enough of a fantasy for us. So now we have to create this virtual world where we can escape even deeper into our imaginations and fantasies and be whatever we want and not have to yeah, accept reality. Like there's just so many layers of dissociation in our society. And so that concept, dissociation, is also going to become very important because people don't think they're dissociating, but they are. You're gonna find a lot of people who think that they're not dissociating because they work really hard at their job and they take their lives very seriously and they have very strong moral grounding and they care a lot about other people and they're part of the community and they're involved in all those things, but that's still dissociating. It's not dissociating as much as somebody like myself, perhaps, that who is, deep into the fantasy of just escaping into deeper layers of representation where I can just represent myself however I want. But now we're getting full circle. Now we're coming full circle. Is that not what I originally said is the very nature of the real? It is something which cannot be represented. It is something which you cannot imagine. It cannot be symbolically defined, right? It's post-structural. Now, if that's the case, then what do we see? What is the meta pattern here of us dissociating further and further and further away from what is given on the surface to be able to express ourselves in whatever weird way we want, right? That reflects the real. And there it is, you see, at work, behind the scenes, driving everything all the way down, and we don't even realize it. We're totally unconscious of it. It's there, but we can't even imagine it. We can only catch glimpses of it like this, like I'm explaining it to you. You might start to get this intuitive idea of what I'm talking about. But even that is just the shadow on the wall. It's Plato's cave analogy where you're just seeing shadows on the wall. And we can have very accurate shadows. We can have very clearly defined shadows that come very close to looking very similar to the thing. And, holograms that look very much like the original, but they're still just copies. They're still just representations. They're just shadows. The actual thing is something we cannot directly see, we cannot interact with. So this began when you were born, and then the first association that you engage in is this construction of an ego. You have to have this central self that you believe is you, right? And that begins with Lacan in the mirror stage, where he says you see yourself in a mirror as an infant, and then you recognize how when you move your arms around, the thing in the mirror moves and follows you, and you have this sense of control. And that is the first like deep dissociation that you engage in, this idea that you can control reality, that there's like a consistency to it, that there's like a structure to reality, that there are rules that can be followed, and that as long as you follow them, you will get what you want, and that there's a you that's following them, and so on and so forth. Like it just clicks, and the whole thing crystallizes right then and there, and you're set off on your journey. The hero is born on his journey in that moment. And so you form an identity at that moment. And then it just crystallizes more and more as you grow up and you encounter more and more of the fantasy, and you get lost in the journey, and you write your story, and it just keeps going, and it gets complicated, and you have all these different ways that you can describe yourself that are part of the story, like these personality models and stuff that are just themselves dissociations from truth. They're just representations of it. And they're just like art. It's like looking at a piece of artwork and being told, this is what you look like. And so you're like, oh, okay. And you just believe it. And you can't do anything else. You can deny that and be like, okay, that's not me. And you can look at every picture that you've ever seen and say, that's not me, that's not me. And you're right, they aren't. But that's all you have. All you have are those representations. All you have is your imagination. You don't have direct access to the real. You have escaped from it because it's so overwhelming and so horrifying. It's so intense. It's so pure. It's so absolute. You see, there's not enough chaos in it. There's not enough confusion in it. There's not enough pain in it. There's not enough joy in it. There's not enough whatever. There's something lacking in the real. There's this lack that you felt. Because that is the nature of the real. That is the nature of true reality. It's lack. Even Arthur Schopenhauer touches on this when he talks about the idea that life is suffering. And there's nothing you can do about that. It's like important. It's important that life is suffering. It's the spark that drives you on. It pushes you on. It motivates you to get away from the pain, to seek the pleasure. And Freud talks about it, the pleasure principle, that the ego is fundamentally a construct for satisfying the needs of the id, the desires that you feel, those unconscious drives that require satisfaction. Lacan calls it jouissance, which is like the desire to desire. It is not the thing that you desire that brings satisfaction. Satisfaction is the worst possible thing, because then you would not desire anything anymore, and you would become bored and empty inside. You would only be satisfied for a short time, and then you would want something else. And that is our nature, to always be wanting, never satisfied. We just feel that constantly. And then Freud gets into what he calls the death drive, where he says that there is an even deeper layer where we want that to end. We want to stop desiring. We're tired of feeling the lack. We're tired of lacking. And so we want to end it all and just die and commit suicide and destroy everything around us and create even more lack so that there's nothing to lack at all. And it's, you see, like it just gets into these weird compensations, these weird reciprocal relationships, this yin and yang thing that goes deep, man. It goes deep. Um, and that's what drives you to create an identity. That's what drives you to create a personality. That's what drives you to have a temperament. Okay. And all these different things that form your identity are escapisms. They're ways to escape from the fact that you don't have an identity. You really don't have one. And if you did, it would be something unimaginable. It would be something you could never know. So all you have are these masks. You have these dissociations, these layers of dissociation that you engage in every day. Your personality is the most important one, your ego. That's the one that's habitual. It's simply the way of dissociating from reality that's the most familiar and easiest for you to do. It feels the most natural for you. It's the one that you were the most successful at. And so you persist in doing it. And then when you come across situations in your fantasy that you find your ego is not an effective strategy for coping with, you will escape into a different mask called a persona. You will put on a different social role around different people when you're around your parents, when you're around your boss at work, when you're at church, when you're having sex with your wife or your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. Like you have all these different compensations that you're making with the other person or with society or with the situation. And those are all forms of dissociation from your true self. And then your true self, if such a thing exists, is a dissociation from something that cannot even be represented. So it's just layer upon layer of representation. And this gets into Jean Baudrillard. I think I'm butchering his name, Jean Baudrillard, who talks about simulation and simulacra and hyperreality, where we get so dissociated, we're so lost in the sauce, that the sauce becomes the real. The imaginary, the representations become reality, and we can't tell the difference anymore. They're more real than the real. You see, we call them objective reality. We call it objective. And we say it's fact. It's a fact. It's a knowledge. I know it, etc. There's this confidence, this conviction in it. Okay, but Lacan and Jean and all these different psychologists and postmodern philosophers and such would say, no, no, no. You see, that's all just representation. That's all just a fantasy. The closest you could get to it would be schizophrenia or dreams, like schizophrenic experiences in your sleep and stuff like that. Yeah, very much the opposite of what we are taught to believe. Where normally we think, like that schizophrenia is a dissociation from reality, when it is completely the opposite. It is totally the other way around. Schizophrenia is, if anything, closer to the real. It's becoming less dissociated, you see? You're becoming more like what you really are, which is like complete madness. It can't be comprehended. It can't be contained. It can't be represented. It breaks every boundary and becomes like just utter madness, utter chaos. The complexity is too much. It's transcendent. And so it breaks down all the non-transcendental, mundane boundaries in life that we take for granted. Like even our physical experiences start to fall apart and you have hallucinations, delusions, and psychosis. And all of those come with this stigmatization that they're bad because they push back against the shared illusion that we all engage in that's called society, culture, right? And you're being too much of an individual. You're too neurodivergent. You're not masking anymore. You're not masking yourself effectively in order to fit in. You're not adapting to the status quo, to what society calls upon you to do. You see? You're not playing the game. You're not following the rules. You're being a bad person, in some sense. That's where that leads. And even if in psychology they try very hard to distance themselves from that kind of moral authority of labeling it as a stigma or bad, there's still that sentiment embedded in the words dysfunction, personality disorder. You see, they're still implying that there's this negative sort of energy to it, that it's not a good thing. It's not good. And you should be getting better. You're not healthy. You're sick. You're mentally ill. You need to be treated. You need to take these drugs to help you continue to fantasize. These drugs will help you go back to sleep, my friend. They will help you be more of a dreamer like the rest of us. You'll become more immersed into the fantasy, more dissociated from your true self. So then the question is, how can I possibly become more schizophrenic, more like I really am in my deepest true core? How do I become more like the thing that cannot be represented? How do I become more like that, but then still have a place in the world, still have friends, still find love, still find acceptance? Well, I'll tell you, you can't. You just can't. There's going to be people who you meet that come close to it, who are very much themselves, maybe borderline schizophrenic, prodromal as they call that, like myself, for instance. And you'll find others like that who, this is what I talked about with shadows being close, but not quite the real thing. You'll find people who are very close, but not quite the real thing. And there is no way that you can really like completely be free, completely take the mask off. You will always have a mask on your face. This world is a mask. Your body, your memories are a mask. This is not real. This is not real. This is subjective. This is a dream. And it is, in fact, dreams that are closer to the real, that are closer to reality. The more something is not real, the more it is real. The more something does not fit into this universe and its laws and its experiences, the more it transcends them, the more it is absolutely true. So everything that makes no sense makes the most sense. This is a complete inversion of the way that you normally process information. And some of you are going to be hearing this and thinking, yes, yes, exactly. Oh, this makes so much sense. Does it though? And then there will be many of you who say, that makes no sense. This is all just nonsense. It's just schizobabble. You're right. You're right. Exactly. You see? That's the difference. It's yin and yang. And you have to be careful of assuming that one has primacy. It's just two different sides of a coin. The reality really would be both if we want to get down to it. The fantasy is part of reality. This whole illusionary world that we live in, this imaginary world, and all of its laws and all of its representations, is just a layer of reality. It's part of it. It might be one stage dissociated from the root of reality, which cannot be expressed or represented, but it's still part of it. Like, it's like patterns in the noise. It's like staring at a screen of static, staring at a TV screen that's just fuzz long enough for eternity, even. You just start to see things. You eventually just start to see whole realities unfold before you in that static, in that noise. It's like a million monkeys banging away on the typewriters. Eventually they'll write Shakespearean epics. In all of time, any change, any fluctuation, any randomness whatsoever will produce all of this. At some point, even if you believe in the idea that the universe is a completely random event in a sea of random events, like an multiverse or something of failed universes, if you will, and that only in this one could we exist because this one is fine tuned for our existence. And so it's just random that eventually this universe popped into existence. Like it was just like there are higher, yeah, whatever. So then, like, yeah, even within that paradigm, you can still see what I'm saying. Like, eventually, you're gonna get this. You're gonna get the one reality where this all happens, where it all works out this way. And so that's kind of how we go about constructing a personality. That's the nature of the real. So now that I've really laid out these concepts, I think I can go forward in explaining the the structure of identity and personality and stuff, and go more into that. Um, so I'm probably going to redo those videos, and those will come later. But this, I think, really we had to lay this out because this is like the disclaimer that comes along with all those videos that I'm going to make, where I don't want you to take them at face value and think I'm just telling you like facts and this is just the way it is, and then go out and very confidently abuse it. These are just frameworks that I'm giving you. These are just like opinions, man, like ways of looking at things. And no one really knows like what's going on. We all just have our opinions and we can share in consensus and form these agreements that become society and accepted in historical narratives that we're in. But again, that's just the flavor of the month. That's the FOMO we live in. So yeah, I guess that's about it. The next video, I will talk more about really important concepts that I think are easy to grasp and use to represent people, um, like introversion and extroversion, and also rational and irrational. And then I'll go a little bit more into that. That's all more Jungian stuff. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this brief little video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.